France's labor regulations have famously been symbolized by the Labor Code. Now, that's a weighty 4,000-page treatise, but the government now wants to loosen a number of rules. By proposing controversial reforms, the French government aims to curb the country's unemployment rate, but at what cost? These reforms will give employers more scope to lay off workers and cut costs, and make it easier to fire workers on economic grounds when companies run into difficulties. Well, protests against the controversial labor reforms have exploded all over France, with just over a year to go to France's 2017 presidential elections. President Hollande is making one final attempt to cement his place in French history, be it of notoriety, with these controversial reforms. Stay tuned for the debate right here on Press TV.
These protesters are boiling with anger over the French government's plan to make changes to labor regulations. The demonstrations first began on March 9th and turned into violent protests which saw dozens injured and many arrested. The capital Paris, Nantes, Lyon, Marseille and Toulouse have been the main hotspots in the past weeks. The French police have responded brutally in a desperate attempt to control the situation. According to the government, some 1,300 people have been detained since the beginning of the rallies. A youth movement dubbed the Sunrising has pledged to stand firm until the government discards the planned reforms. Meanwhile, industrial actions continue to disrupt different sections of France's economic sectors. Truck drivers blockade roads and cause huge traffic jams here and there. Protesters also aim to cut off oil refineries and food supply depots, infuriating government officials. France's transport minister has urged labor unions to halt their industrial actions during the upcoming Euro 2016 football tournament. But union leaders have pledged to bring the event to a standstill and use the opportunity to make the government give in to their demands. The month-long protests and strikes were fueled by President François Hollande's unrelenting stance. He has ordered Prime Minister Valls to bypass the parliament and go ahead with the reforms. The French president says he will not withdraw his plans, arguing that the reforms will encourage firms to employ more, leading to lower joblessness. But opponents of the bill say the proposed changes will make it easier for employers to fire workers.
The law that was forced through by the French government by an executive order, effectively against the will of the people and against even with no majority from the parliaments, what makes a mockery of not only democracy among the people in terms of what the people want, but it also makes a mockery of democracy at the level of the government.
The French are still reeling from two series of coordinated terror attacks in capital Paris, and the current labor crisis has added insult to injury. On Thursday, French lawmakers voted to extend the country's state of emergency for the third time. The terror attacks, blamed by some on the government's intervention in the Middle East, together with harsh economic policies, have made François Hollande the least popular French president in history.
Well, joining us now to offer us more insight on that story, we're joined by author and journalist Gearóid Ó Colmáin, who's with us from the French capital, Paris. And also joining us from London is Sean O'Grady, a finance editor of The Independent. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with our guest in Paris, Mr. Ó Colmáin. In the face of these massive demonstrations, French President François Hollande said that he would, quote unquote, not give in to the protesters as he sees the reforms as yet again, quoting the president, providing visibility and stability to create jobs. Well, that's surely not what the French demonstrators out on the streets feel about the controversial reforms to the labor code.
That's certainly the case. What we are seeing, I think, now is the final stand, or the last stand of Spartacus in France. This is the kind of uprising a lot of people were predicting would happen if these measures were advocated and implemented, and if the implementation of these measures was attempted by this French government. So what we are seeing really is a massive grassroots uprising against deeply undemocratic measures which will destroy social security, destroy a sense of job security, and of course increase pauperization of the French working class. It is highly significant that there have been major actions in Marseille, because Marseille was in the past a major bastion of French left-wing militancy. And in 1947, there was a major strike in France. And that strike, the general strike, lasted for a very long time and was eventually crushed by a socialist candidate, Gaston Defferre, who, in collaboration with the CIA, used foreign scabs to break up the labor movement and, of course, the drug mafia in Marseille, to the devastation of the working class there. And they have been very much abandoned by the Communist Party since then. One of the important things to bear in mind here is that while these actions are definitely concrete, well-organized, and could prove effective if they're followed through, there still is a lack of coordinated leadership in this movement. And that is essentially the sort of void that has been created by the actions, or the inaction rather, of the French Communist Party, which since the 1980s has no longer defended working class interests, but is essentially a social democratic party. So I think what we're seeing is very significant. The big question is, will they succeed? What we do need now is a coordinated action, but also movement. What exactly do they, what is the end result, and how are they going to get it? The threat to disrupt the games, the football games, is, of course, could prove very effective. But when this regime is threatened, then it resorts to force. There have been numerous cases of police brutality against workers in France, barely reported by the media over the last few years, and we're seeing a lot of that right now. Another point I should make here, of course, is that the parallel movement that has been created in Paris, called Nuit debout, which I've criticized on numerous occasions, is, I think, was created to serve as a distraction from the real grassroots class struggle that is occurring throughout the country. And that is why the media have been focusing on Nuit debout, which of course is designed to go absolutely nowhere and has no ideology which could challenge the system. So the real battle is in the factories, it's in the refineries, and it's on the streets.
Sure. Let's bring in our guest from London, Mr. O'Grady. Mr. O'Grady, when we hear Hollande say that he will stand firm, one can't help but think about the previous attempt of labor reforms that, in fact, was a repeat of the massive demonstrations, the student protests, rather, that took place 10 years ago that forced then-President Jacques Chirac to withdraw his labor reforms. The question is, will Hollande buckle should such events reoccur?
Well, I don't know if President Hollande will buckle. As you said in your film, he's incredibly unpopular in France, I'm afraid. So he may feel as though he has nothing to lose, because there's not much chance of him getting any support for what he's doing now in any case, so he might as well get on with it. I hope, and a lot of people in Britain who are friends of France, hope that he does succeed in reforming the French economy. The fundamental problem in the French economy is unemployment. And the unemployment is structural, which is to say that it's down to the nature and the organization and the regulation of the labor force and the shape of the French economy. And France has a relatively high unemployment rate. It's been very stubbornly high. It's about 10%. It affects a lot of the youth of France. It affects a lot of the second, third generation children of migrants from North Africa in particular, who came over, who tend to live in socially deprived areas and poor housing. In France, they've created a two-tier society, a two-tier labor market for the middle classes, for the professional classes, for the skilled workers who are lucky enough to have jobs. They are looked after very, very well indeed. They have relatively short working weeks. They have good social insurance. They have generous pension provision and so forth. But for the people who are locked out of that labour market, they are locked out. And the worst thing that can happen to you, really, is if you're 17, 18, 20 years old, is not being able to get a job, not being able to start a career, not being able to build something. And the longer that goes on, we found this in Britain in the 1980s, the longer that goes on, you have what the economists call scarring of the labour force. It's a social scarring. So the people who are unable to get jobs, are unable to pick up the habits of work and get into work and build careers and so on, they end up on the scrap heap, and they end up in and out of very casual occupations at the very best. So I hope that Francois Hollande and the French authorities do beat the strikers. I hope that they reform the labour market, because that's in the interests of the very poorest people in France themselves, not the people who are driving the trucks and who are rioting at the moment, but the people who have no jobs and who have in the past rioted because they have no jobs. And the only way to reform the labour market is to make France, to create those jobs, is to make the French economy competitive once again, with world rising economic powers such as China and India and Korea and so on, and to create, opportunities for the young people of France, which would help their social cohesion. We went through a lot of this under Mrs. Thatcher in the 1980s in Britain. Some of it was good, some of it was bad, a lot of it was painful, and we had a lot of social disruption and violence as well. Mm-hmm. But in the longer run, it was good for Britain, and it meant that we've got the best job creation and the best employment record pretty much of the major economies in Europe. Our wages are not as high, our unions are not as strong, our social insurance and our pensions are not as good as they are in France, but the benefit of it is that we have lower levels of unemployment than we otherwise would.
Mr. Ó Colmáin, would you like to counter what Mr. O'Grady said? He believes that these labor reforms will ultimately result in job security for the French.
No, they will not. You only have to look at all of the other countries in Europe and the United States. The United States has a massive unemployment problem, and it's getting worse by the day, not better. The United States has never had a coherent, organized labor movement, and labor conditions have been getting worse, at least in particular since the 1990s, since they liberalized the economy even more. I think there are other factors I should mention here as well. You have the ruling elite in France are very much in favor of immigration. Now, the leaders of the French labor movement in the post-war era, I'm talking about the Communist Party, had a very critical view of immigration. They saw immigration as a tool of the ruling class against workers to drive down wages, to reduce salaries, and to pauperize the workers and destroy all of the social gains they got through a class struggle, strikes, and so on. And that was a correct analysis. What we've seen in recent years is an attempt to replace the French workforce, which is a multicultural, multiracial workforce, but an organized workforce, and reduce it to the level of a lumpen proletariat. That is to say, a proletariat that has no sense of consciousness of its own interests, of its own class interests, and that is completely at the hands and at the disposition of employers to be hired and fired. That, of course, is why Britain has been promoting immigration to such an extent. They're constantly in need of new desperate immigrants who will work for less and live in appalling conditions. If you look at the poverty in Britain, it is absolutely appalling. There are people going hungry to schools all over Britain. Similarly, in France, you now have a situation where children are going hungry. So to suggest that prosperity is being promoted by destroying working people's lives is preposterous. This is going to pauperize the French organized labor. It's going to pauperize all of the workers who have had jobs that can pay their rent. And it's going to create a situation where a French citizen will be reduced to the status of a refugee. And that is essentially what is going to happen if these laws go ahead. You're going to see a pauperization of French society. Everything that is good in French society is being systematically destroyed by this government. Everything that was good in France was the labor security, early retirement for teachers, a lot of social gains that were got through massive struggle over the last century. These things constitute the basis of a civilized society, and that is being destroyed. The only people who will benefit from this are the oligarchs, the finance sector, and those people who should be paying more taxes instead of opening bank accounts in Switzerland and forcing the middle class and the working class to pay taxes to keep the system going. So this is going to pauperize French society, not enrich it.
Okay, obviously you two gentlemen disagree on these labor reforms. There are also two extremes in France, two different viewpoints. The government and business leaders say the reforms will encourage companies to take on more workers and on permanent contracts rather than temporary ones. But unions and some of the left of the ruling Socialist Party see an undue threat to job security. Mr. O'Grady, how are these two sides so far apart in what they're seeing?
Well, I mean, it's natural that they're going to be far apart because the people who've got jobs in France, as I say, skilled workers, professional people, and especially people in the public sector who work for the government and local government, schools and so on, they've got a lot to lose because they've got a good time going on. They're really having a party at the moment. But the rest of the French are not having a party. The rest of the French, especially the children and grandchildren, as I say, of people who came over from North Africa, the immigrant children and grandchildren, they are not having a party. They're having a very hard time. They're excluded from French society. And they have no possibility of building a life and raising a family in something like prosperity if they cannot have a job. There are poor people in Britain, but there were poor people in Britain too when we had a highly unionized, large state, sort of big brother kind of economy many decades ago. Our people are more prosperous than they've ever been in their lives. We have higher employment than we've had before. We have a flexible labour market. We got through the recession in Britain without a gigantic increase in unemployment because workers and unions, for that matter, were very pragmatic, they were very flexible, and they kept their wages down during the downturn. That protected jobs, that kept skills in companies, that helped companies survive, that did protect profits, and it did protect investment. I don't believe in a them and us society. I don't believe that if you strike against your company and you push it into a loss, that's a triumph for you. It isn't. You will lose your job eventually if you push and push and push wages higher, squeeze, squeeze, squeeze profits. That's where you end up. You end up rather really like the French are. And the German economy, which is a more efficient one than the French economy, a more successful one than the French economy, the Germans had to reform their labour market a few years ago, at least for new entrants into the labour market, new people coming into employment, because they had a similar issue, they had a similar problem. We in Europe, in the European Union, are at a crossroads at the moment, and the British, who are deciding whether to stay in the European Union, are also at a crossroads by the same token, which is, are we going to have a European Union? Are we going to have a European economy that is fit for what we in Britain call the global race? Is it something that's going to be able to compete with India, with South Korea, with Indonesia, with Mexico? And for the Western European economies, for the Eastern European economies as well. Are we going to be able to do that? If we aren't able to do that, we don't want to do that, we will stagnate, we will fall behind, we will lose jobs, we will lose factories, we will lose companies, we will lose prosperity as sure as anything in the world. And you ask the Greeks about that. They've already been through it.
Let's go back to our guest in Paris, Mr. Ó Colmáin. Much attention has been brought to the issue of the excessive use of force by the police. Is Paris so keen to avoid a repeat of those massive student protests that happened a decade ago, that maybe overview of police conduct is a little looser now given the circumstances?
I would say yes. I think that there is an increase absolutely in police brutality. Just to respond to a couple of points made there, I'm flabbergasted to hear that the working class are interested in squeezing profits. It's an astonishing statement. The workers of France are squeezing profits from work. Let's be clear here. The
well, they're trying to. They're trying to. If you push wages, if you go on strike, and you push wages higher and higher,
let me finish,
that's
please.
where you end up.
Let me finish, please. Let me finish. I did not interrupt you. The capitalist mode of production requires a worker to work a certain number of hours during the day. The rest of the day is basically free work. It is the capitalist who is squeezing profits by extracting surplus surplus capital from labor. Now, that is essentially the reason why you have this crisis in the first place, the global crisis of capitalism, the global economic crisis. And secondly, that is the reason why they cannot make enough profits here. So they need to delocalize labor and go to Indonesia and build a slave factory there and work people to death. The working conditions in those countries are among the worst in the world. They're worse than slavery. At least a slave, if you have a slave, you'll hold on to him and you'll make sure that he's able to work tomorrow. With these workers, they're disposable. You can throw them in the bin. And there's many more of them coming. So to suggest that we are to compete with Indonesia is ludicrous. This is not a model of society we want to see. And it is absolutely ludicrous. And this is exactly how the ruling class see it. Like your guest in London, that's how they see it. But that is not how workers see it. We do not want to compete with third world countries where workers have no rights. What we need is an end to this process of pillage and destruction and the end of the absolute oppression of the working class, not just here, but around the world. And this movement is part of that process. It needs leadership. This mode of production is decadent. It is involved in foreign wars of destruction and genocide.
Mr. O'Colmáin, let's allow Mr. O'Grady to get a final thought in. Mr. O'Grady, we're running short of time. Please give us your final thoughts.
And your media has a lot to do with that, promoting propaganda and lies.
There's a billion
on a constant, every single day, your media is telling lies about these wars.
Who have come out of poverty. 1 billion people have been raised out of poverty in China and India and all these other countries in the world. You call them slaves. They are becoming prosperous. You want to leave them where they were under Mao. You know, all this poverty and agricultural subsistence farming. No, they want to develop, they want to create new jobs, they want to become prosperous like the West, and that's exactly what's happening at the moment. There's no reason to lock them out of our markets. There's no reason to treat their workers worse than our workers, or better than our workers for that matter. And there's no reason to stop immigration either. If people want to find a better life in Britain, we're very welcoming on the whole towards those people who want to do it. We have to have a policy on it, but we have done that, and it's been of great benefit to the British economy and British culture and British life. It's all good.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately we reached the end of the program. So much to say and so little time. Thanks to our guests, author and journalist Gearóid Ó Colmáin, joining us from Paris, and also finance editor of The Independent, Mr. Sean O'Grady, joining us from London. And thanks for watching Press TV's The Debate. I'm signing off now from our studios here in Tehran. Bye, everybody.